In an old etching, the woman stands by a wooden bed, a spoon in hand, hair neatly tied up, her eyes blank. The child in the image lies on their side, eyes closed, gently, as if drifting into sleep. But in reality, that child would never wake up the same again. With a cold hand, she had used arsenic, a poison hard to detect, as a tool to manipulate fate. Her name was Mary Ann Cotton. More than 20 victims, from husbands to children, from lovers to stepchildren, fell one by one after drinking her tea or eating her soup. All quietly vanished under the guise of symptoms that seemed like ordinary illness, and the timing of each death lined up as neatly as names on a ledger. Each passing was carefully staged by Mary Ann Cotton, a life insurance policy signed in advance, followed by a predetermined end and a funeral carried out like routine ceremony. I used to think serial killers were people who screamed with wild eyes and trembling hands. But Mary Ann Cotton was different. She remained calm as those around her disappeared, and when the police arrived, she simply looked at them, then gently set the child down. A key report recorded the testimony of the welfare officer, the first person to suspect Mary Ann. He asked, half cautious, half mocking, "This child won't make it either, will they?" She simply smiled and replied, "They'll go like the others did." That was the only thing she said about the child who was fading. Rows of black stone houses stood solemnly, almost identical to the etchings found in old archival records. This was a typical coal mining region in early 19th century England, where life revolved around deep, narrow shafts. Men, their faces blackened with coal dust, faced danger daily in the dark pits below. Women stayed above, cooking, tending to children, and living in constant dread, never knowing when they might receive tragic news from the mines. These stone homes, packed closely together, bore silent witness to the brutal cycle of labor, survival, and loss. Mary Ann was born on October 31st, 1832, the eldest daughter of Michael Robson, a pitman working the hazardous job of shaft sinking, and Margaret Lonsale, a strict Methodist mother. The Robson family lived in poverty, moving constantly between coal towns in pursuit of short-term contracts. When Mary Ann was 8, the family relocated to Merton, a rural village in Durham. There, disaster struck. In 1842, Michael Robson fell 150 feet to his death in a shaft at Merton Colliery. His death plunged the family into destitution. His body was returned home in a sack labeled "Property of the South Hetton Coal Company," as if he were nothing more than a broken piece of mining equipment, a memory that would haunt young Mary Ann. Her mother soon remarried George Stott, another miner, but Mary Ann never warmed to her stepfather. Still, Stott brought financial stability, something researchers later believed fed Mary Ann's lifelong obsession with money. In Merton, Mary Ann was described as a devout girl, regularly attending Sunday school at the Wesleyan Chapel. Teachers noted she was well-behaved, clean, and of good intellect. At 16, she left home to work as a domestic servant, then briefly trained as a nurse in South Hetton. 3 years later, she returned to Durham and took up work as a seamstress, a common trade for women at the time. At age 20, Mary Ann married William Mowbray, a laborer beginning a turbulent marriage. These records reflect the hardship that shaped her early life. Mary grew up in harsh circumstances where poverty and instability shaped her character. Though described as devout and reasonably intelligent, Mary Ann carried within her a deep sense of insecurity and an ambition for financial stability, likely born from her difficult childhood. Like many young women of her time, she married a modest man in hopes of building a stable life. But this was only the beginning of a long, dark chain of tragedy and crime. Mary faced the harsh reality of being a young mother trapped in poverty. Cornwall wasn't where she wanted to be, but that year, following her husband William Mowbray, who had taken a job as a railway worker, she had no choice. The workers' housing consisted of hastily built wooden shacks with sinking dirt floors, no clean water, and far from any doctor. Her life quickly sank into a cycle of unending loss. Within just a few years, several of her children died young, lost in infancy to illness and harsh living conditions. Their fragile bodies gave way to a lack of medical care and extreme deprivation. Doctors were scarce, and medicine even scarcer. Death came quietly inside the cramped and crumbling home. The children born into poverty passed away with what was called gastric fever, a term that, in hindsight, has raised suspicions of possible arsenic involvement. But at the time, knowledge was limited. This was common in Victorian England, where child mortality reached up to 30% in working-class communities. Mary Ann found herself trapped in the role of a mother, confronting a brutal cycle. Each childbirth brought a flicker of hope, which quickly faded when the child failed to survive the winter or an unnamed illness. That suffocating sense of entrapment began to harden her. Mary Ann slowly became numb. Historical records, though they don't quote her directly, portray a woman who grew increasingly silent at each funeral. Grief gradually gave way to detachment. As she stood beside each tiny grave, her eyes appeared vacant, her tears long dried up. Funerals, once devastating, became routine. Just another part of daily life, like cooking or washing. Women, especially those in the laboring class, were expected to endure. The death of children was seen as fate, part of the harsh reality they had no choice but to accept. Neighbors were too preoccupied with their own survival, and local authorities remained indifferent to deaths that didn't raise clear alarms. That indifference may have planted the seed for a moral breakdown in Mary Ann's mind. She began to convince herself, if death was inevitable, why not let it happen on her terms? Why not turn loss into opportunity? Life insurance policies, which were common among working-class families, became a financial escape route that she gradually embraced. From burying loved ones in sorrow, she began to view each loss as a potential financial solution, something she could control. In 1865, in Hendon, Sunderland, William Mowbray, Mary Ann Cotton's first husband, died in agony, showing symptoms of what was then called gastric fever. His death, along with that of their two remaining children, marked a turning point in Mary Ann's life. She received a significant life insurance payout, equivalent to half a year's wages for a laborer. But what stirred whispers among neighbors wasn't just the money. There was something strange. People close to Mary Ann kept dying shortly after she had cared for them, and often right after insurance policies had been signed. The symptoms were consistent: abdominal pain, vomiting, weakness. Dr. William Byers, who had treated one of the victims, noted that the symptoms didn't fully align with typical stomach illness. Although he had no concrete proof, he documented the irregularities in the patient's file, a detail later revisited during the investigation. Mary Ann, with her neat appearance and soft-spoken voice, was always the last one standing, and the one who benefited most from the deaths. After William's passing, she remarried George Ward. Like the first husband, he also died not long afterward. A year later, she became the wife of James Robinson, but he threw her out after discovering she had stolen money and pressured him into signing a life insurance policy. The most tragic case was her fourth husband, Frederick Cotton. He died along with two of his sons, leaving behind a large insurance payout for Mary. Mary Ann's behavior began to take on an unsettling quality. At the funerals, she often stood silently, her gaze distant. Even when she wept, people sensed something wasn't genuine. Neighbors noticed an odd detachment in the way she appeared, not quite emotionless, but far removed from the grief they expected. She was a frequent visitor to the pharmacy of Mr. John Trotter in Sunderland, where she bought arsenic under the common excuse of rat poison, a widely accepted reason in Victorian times, as the substance was sold freely. But the way she concealed the tiny bottles and how casually she spoke of death sent chills down people's spines. "She won't live long." Such remarks, though brief, left a deep impression on those who heard them, like Jane Headley, an acquaintance from Hendon. Little details began to connect. Her name started coming up more often in doctors' offices and police desks. Investigators quietly compiled a list of deaths surrounding her and noticed a troubling pattern. From that point on, the truth slowly began to surface. In the small village of West Auckland in 1872, the police, supported by local officials and the press, carefully followed a trail of clues that uncovered a deadly pattern spanning nearly 2 decades. More than 20 suspected victims were eventually linked to Mary Ann. The investigation relied not only on emerging forensic science of the time, but also on growing suspicion within the community, which propelled Mary Ann from a struggling mother to a defendant standing before the court of justice. Everything began with the death of Charles Edward Cotton, the 7-year-old stepson of Mary Ann's 4th husband, Frederick Cotton. Prior to his death, Mary Ann had attempted to send Charles to the workhouse, seeing him as a burden as she prepared to remarry her lover, John Quick Manning. Thomas Riley, a parish official and assistant coroner, had received this request from Mary Ann. Just days later, she reported that Charles had died of gastric fever. Riley, who had recently seen the boy in good health, grew suspicious immediately. He alerted the local police and persuaded Dr. William Kilburn to delay issuing a death certificate until a formal investigation could be conducted. Immediately after Charles's death, Mary Ann didn't visit a doctor, but instead rushed to the office of the British and Prudential Insurance Company to claim the life insurance policy she'd taken out on the boy. However, the company refused to pay due to the absence of a death certificate, a detail that deepened Riley's suspicions. According to experts, her haste was highly unusual and raised serious questions about her true motives. Riley pushed for an autopsy, which was carried out by Dr. Kilburn at Mary Ann's home. The preliminary examination revealed abnormalities in Charles's stomach. Lab tests confirmed the presence of arsenic, a common yet difficult to detect poison at the time. This discovery shifted the case from suspicion to an official criminal investigation. Under the direction of Inspector James Henderson, West Auckland police arrested Mary Ann on charges of murder. The police expanded their inquiry, exhuming other bodies for testing. The results consistently revealed high levels of arsenic, reinforcing the theory that Mary Ann had been using the poison over an extended period. Despite the forensic evidence, proving that Mary Ann had intentionally murdered her victims remained a challenge. Arsenic was sold freely in local pharmacies, and the symptoms of poisoning closely resembled common illnesses like gastritis. Moreover, the lack of reliable birth and death records in the Victorian era made it difficult to determine the total number of victims. Still, witnesses like pharmacist John Trotter of Sunderland confirmed that Mary Ann regularly purchased arsenic, and neighbors in West Auckland, such as Mrs. Jane Headley, recalled strange remarks she made about Charles's death, like, "That boy won't live much longer." These details painted a picture of a cold and calculating woman. From the image of a poor, struggling mother, Mary Ann gradually came to be known by the public as the silent killer of County Durham. If in the past she had allowed death to arrive like fate, now she chose who would live and who would die. The trial of Mary Ann Cotton took place in the spring of 1873 at the Durham County Court. The courtroom was packed with people from nearby mining villages. Many came just to see the woman who had once been viewed as a victim of circumstance, now standing silently, accused of being a serial killer. The charges focused on the death of young Charles Edward Cotton because it was the only case with sufficient forensic evidence, though police suspected more than 20 other deaths, including those of husbands, children, her own mother, and friends. Proving them was nearly impossible. The records were vague, autopsies had been minimal, and more importantly, this was a time before DNA and electronic medical files. The law had to rely on what could be seen, heard, and a handful of primitive lab results. Prosecutor Charles Russell presented strong evidence. The autopsy revealed arsenic in Charles's body, along with witness testimonies regarding Mary Ann's purchases of arsenic and her unsettling remarks. Defense attorney Thomas Campbell Foster argued that the arsenic could have come from wallpaper dye, but Dr. Thomas Scattergood of Leeds countered, stating the toxic concentration was far too high for that. After 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury found her guilty. Outside the court, the crowd erupted, anger mixed with a strange sense of relief. Mary Ann collapsed, but continued to deny any wrongdoing, which only inflamed public outrage. Some called her a heartless poisoner. After several days of proceedings, the sentence was delivered. Capital punishment under the law of that time. In one of the few remaining written records, it said that she asked just one question after leaving the courtroom. Will they let me be buried next to my child? On March 24, 1873, at Durham Prison, Mary Ann was executed. The procedure was later criticized as poorly handled. Her death was slow, and it stirred public debate. While some expressed sympathy for the painful end, most saw it as justice. The verdict closed the case and spurred reforms in poison control laws. Mary Ann Cotton was left etched in public memory as a symbol of Victorian-era crime. The case of Mary Ann Cotton exposed the dark corners of Victorian society and the human psyche, twisted by poverty, loss, and greed. As the spotlight on the case dimmed on March 24, 1873, with the rope tightening around Mary Ann's neck at Durham Prison, questions of morality, society, and psychology continued to linger, haunting those who looked deeper into the story of the Black Widow. From an ethical perspective, Mary Ann challenged the boundary between victim and perpetrator. Born into poverty in Low Moorsley, she grew up in a harsh world where the deaths of children and minors were everyday occurrences. When she turned arsenic into a weapon and took out life insurance before each funeral, Mary Ann not only betrayed the trust of her family, but also exploited the era's fatalistic view, where illness and death were accepted as part of life. She acted as if fate were a tool. So how far can someone abandoned by society go to take control of their own life? Socially, the case exposed deep fractures in Victorian England. Arsenic was sold freely, life insurance became a temptation, and illness-related deaths were rarely questioned. Women like Mary Ann, trapped in domestic roles and poverty, were nearly invisible under the law until their crimes were uncovered. The case pushed the government to reform laws around poison regulation and insurance, while also highlighting stark inequalities in gender and class. Psychologically, Mary Ann embodied inner chaos. Once a devout girl, she became increasingly detached with each funeral, as witnesses in West Auckland recalled. She no longer cried, her gaze empty as she stood beside the graves. Experts suggested she may have lost the ability to feel pain, replacing it with cold calculation. Each death meant a payout, each victim a burden removed. But was she truly emotionless, or merely a product of a world that left her no other choice? Her silence at the gallows, offering no confession, no remorse, left people chilled, disturbed by the mystery within her soul. What do you think? Was justice truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories that still echo today.